Hey guys, Ramsey here. Welcome to another video. Today we have a late night insight video, and this is a fragrance that multiple people who are in the know have told me, Ramsey, you have to go try this fragrance. And actually it's an Attar, so it's not something that is really on my plate normally, let's say. Attars are one of those things where, if they fall in my lap, I will wear them, but I'm not very well versed in Attars. And, I've done some videos on fragrance houses like Henri Jacques. I actually have more Henri Jacques fragrances to discuss on the channel because I got like 6 or 8 samples. I did a video on one and then I never talked about the rest of them yet. But this is one that sort of got pushed right to the front of the line because it is the Attar version of my favorite Ensar fragrance. So if you guys know my taste, you know that Ensar Oud's EO #1 is my favorite Ensar that I've smelled from him so far, mostly because it focuses on the note of leather. And if you can see, this is full grain leather. And I wish you guys could just smell the inside of that. I don't know if you can see the imperfection there. When you're using full grain leather, there's going to be imperfections from, cuts that happen to the animal during the lifetime, or, it's not the standardized, everyone has this, very, very smooth type leather, everything's perfect. No, full grain leather has this, oh, it just smells divine though. And this fragrance I became very taken with. In fact, I loved it so much I bought a backup. So I own no Ensar fragrances in full bottle except for EO1, and I own 2 bottles. And so basically, this is the Attar version of EO #1, and I believe it came first. So I believe this came first, and then Ensar turned it into a perfume called EO #1 later. But this is called Sultan Leather Attar. How about that for a little decant? Very cool. Great presentation. And I believe it was Nick who sent me this. If it wasn't, I'm very, very sorry to the person who did send it to me. But I think Nick sent me this. So thank you, Nick. Very, very kind of you, mate. This is something I've been wanting to smell for a very long time. And let's do scent of the day first, because one thing that I feel like I should mention talking about Ensar is sometimes when you watch some of the videos from people who really get into the what I have just pretty much came to call the artisanal houses. So we're talking the Agar Auras, the Ensar Ouds, the Ariz Ladores, the Bortnikovs. Those are basically, the rising phoenixes. I'm calling those the artisanal houses, if you will. And I think it's a fair name, because usually it's run by one gentleman who, he is the face of the house, let's say, and he does everything as much as he can, basically. He's the one who goes out and picks the oud, sometimes distills the oud, selects which ingredients go in the fragrances, blends them together. Sometimes they're the perfumer. Most of the time they're not classically trained, they're self-taught. So I think artisanal house is a good name for those type of houses. And many times when you talk to people who get deep into the artisanal game, if you will, they write everything else off. They say, oh, unless you're wearing, a $5,000 for 6-gram oud Attar, you don't know, you're not a real oud head, or you don't know what you're talking about. And they just basically write everything off. And they say you'll fall out of love with all of these fragrances that you bought. Now that you love oud, you'll never like wearing any of the other stuff. And that's just not true for me. I go everywhere, and I always sort of have, and I'm pretty sure I always will. But so I wore this today, and it's funny because the people watching this video are probably going to go, a Tom Ford, oh my goodness, almost like, I pulled out something unholy. But yes, I like everything. I like the designers, I like niche, I like cheap, I like expensive, I like oud, I like, everywhere. I go all over. And so today I wore Plum Japonais for the very first time. This is a 2013 creation by Jan Vasnier. And it's one of these discontinued Tom Fords that people rave emphatically about the good old days when they could buy stuff like this at their local department store. And to be fair, this is a good fragrance, but it's nowhere near as good as some people make it out to be. I mean, some people make this out to be like the greatest fragrance of all time. It is not that at all. It's a good plum liqueur Oud fragrance. This contrasts the real oud we're smelling today, because there's no oud in this. The oud note in here is completely synthetic smelling. Now, maybe they put 0.00001% just to say there's oud in there, but I doubt it. So, anyways, that was my scent of the day, but I quite enjoyed it. You know, this fruity, spicy, even the little bit of sweetness in here. I found that I've come around to Tom Ford's sweetness, and a couple people mentioned this with Noir de Noir, which I've never smelled, and some of the other Tom Fords I haven't smelled before. But I agree with their assessment that the way Tom Ford does sweetness, I actually do enjoy it. I know a lot of times I make it seem like I only like things that are unsweet or completely dry, bone dry. You know, if there's any sweetness, I hate it. And sometimes that's true, but there are some situations where there are some sweet fragrances that I actually don't mind, and this is one of them. It's not bad. It's not, like I said, it's not the best ever, but it's not bad. I enjoyed wearing it today, but contrasting it with the Ensar, it just proves the Ensar fragrance is on just a completely different planet. But I can see how someone who discovers a house like Ensar or Arige will just go, I don't want to wear anything else. That's it. That's all I want to wear. Forget everything else. I'm selling my whole collection, you know. I could see how that could come to fruition, let's say, for somebody. But for me, I go everywhere. You know, my tentacles go all over the place in the fragrance world. If it's a fragrance, I'll talk about it. So again, thank you to Nick for sending this my way. And I've been wearing this sort of on my wrist for the last 4 or 5 hours now. I did a dab on my left wrist about 4.5 hours ago, and I did a fresh dab, a fresh little swipe before the video on my right wrist. And I will say this real quick. I have now talked about a lot of Ensar fragrances on the channel, but I'm no expert. Ensar has a ton of fragrances that he's done, and many of them show up and they're limited edition and they're gone. So like, I don't think you can still buy Sultan Leather Attar. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think on the website it says that it is sold out. I don't think you can buy it anymore. Although maybe you can. Let's see if it'll let me. 3 gram, sturdy glass bottle, add to cart, $350. It looks like you can buy it. I don't know if it's the exact same one or what, but yeah, it let me add it to the cart. So I guess you can still buy Sultan Leather Attar. So that's good to know. I don't think you can buy EO1 anymore, the original EO1. But it looks like you can still buy Sultan Leather Attar. How's that? $350 for 3 grams. 3 grams is not very much, but when all you need is a tiny little swipe, I think they say each gram is equivalent to about 10 mils is what I've read. So each gram in a Tola bottle of oud like that is equivalent to about 10 mils in a perfume that actually carries a carrier, because that's basically the difference with an Attar, is that the Attar is just the pure perfume oil. There's no carrier oil with it. So there's no perfumer's alcohol, there's no coconut oil, whatever they're using as a carrier. And that's why it's extremely concentrated. And so I knew going in that EO number 1 was going, or Sultan Leather Attar was going to be my jam, because EO number 1 is my favorite Ensar fragrance because it's a leather fragrance. And again, if you know my taste, you know that I'm a huge leather fan. I will say that this late night insight video is really meant to be just a quick overview. Okay, so if you want a more detailed review, go watch my review of Ensar Oud's EO number 1. That'll give you a pretty in-depth review, because these two are very similar. It's just that this feels like the Attar version of EO number 1. Now, one of the reasons I wanted to do this video is because I didn't even know there was an Attar version of EO number 1 until somebody who was more versed in Ensar's work pointed it out to me that, hey, Sultan Leather Attar is basically the Attar version of EO number 1. So that's one of the main reasons I wanted to do this, to sort of get the word out there. But if you asked me, what do these fragrances smell like, Ramsey? Basically, just categorize it for me. What is EO number 1 and what is Sultan Leather Attar? So the way that it smells, so the easiest classification is that it is a salty leather supported by a rose oud base. Okay, that's basically the gist of it. And in my videos previously, I said that Ensar Oud EO number 1 should be called EO0 because it's a big circle, is the way the fragrance feels to me. It feels like it just goes on for infinity. And what it feels like is it feels like it opens up with this sort of salty, castoreum heavy, slightly animalic leather. but it's not super animalic, okay? So that's the thing about EO number 1 that I love so much, is that I really felt like it could be a signature scent. You could wear it anywhere, anytime. It felt like sort of the high-powered lawyer wearing a $10,000 suit, sitting on the millionth floor, drinking a, you know, the most expensive scotch you could, what is it, Louis the 13th or something? You know, drinking like the most expensive, you know, alcohol that you can imagine. And so that's the image of EO number 1 in my mind. But the reason I said it's like infinity is because the fragrance feels like it sort of starts to transition, but it ends up right back where it begins, with that salty leather feel. And the Attar basically does something very similar. So imagine a leather note sandwiched between ambergris and oud. Okay, that's what it feels like. It feels like the leather note is sandwiched between ambergris and oud. And if you've come to listen to some of my other Ensar reviews, which again, I'm not an expert on Ensar by any stretch of the imagination, but I've now reviewed EO1 and EO1 Assam, which is like a flanker of EO1, which I didn't care for as much as the original. Jungle Kinam, I've reviewed Jungle Kinam. I reviewed Japanese Rose, which is like a very rare type of rose oil that he sells on his website, like a pure rose Otto, beautiful. I've reviewed Tiger Lust, and I think I reviewed a couple others too. But so I'm getting to know the House of Ensar, and there's more to come. There's more Ensars on deck. I think there's Omeros. There's a bunch of them in here that I want to talk about. There is Oud Sultani. So there's going to be more Ensar reviews to come, let's say, okay? But the reason I mention that is just to say that I'm not some sort of an Ensar expert, but to my nose, what I've come to detect when I smell Ensar fragrances, and they all have a similar feel to the way that they're created. And I've come to basically, in my mind, call that the Ensar Sparkle. That's kind of the way I think of his fragrances, because they all have this sort of big ambergris. Like it's what I imagine taking a hunk of ambergris and just smelling it. That's sort of what his fragrances come off as off of skin. And even this Attar, I was expecting the Attar to be much heavier. I was expecting maybe some of that effervescent, ambergris, salty type feel to come maybe from the creation of making it into a sprayable perfume. But no, even in the Attar, and by the way, the Attar, there's only 3 notes listed in the Attar on Parfumo, which take that with a grain of salt. But they've got leather, rose, and oud, and that's it. But the thing is EO1 is much more detailed on the note listing. So you get things like castoreum, you get fujian, cypress, you get lavender. There's definitely a lavender feel here. Definitely a lavender feel. Nutmeg, which I've said previously, nutmeg like puts a bow on everything. Nutmeg keeps everything in bounds. It doesn't let any of the notes kind of go off astray, right? Rosewood, which I absolutely love rosewood. One of my favorite notes. There's a story behind that. Civet, Thai oud, bourbon rose, Gaiac rose, Himalayan rose, jasmine, Tolu balsam, Turkish rose. So all of these roses. Assam oud, Ethiopian frankincense, Papau sandalwood, ambergris, tobacco, tree moss, and vanilla. Now I can imagine all of these notes in what I'm smelling from Sultan Leather Attar. I can never remember the names. So I can imagine all of this in here, in this Attar. But all that's listed is oud, rose, and leather. And that's it. One thing that I will say as far as maybe differences go, and I'll have to maybe do a side-by-side comparison one day, but off of memory, to me, it seems like in the Attar, the oud note is slightly stronger. It's a little bit more prominent. It doesn't just work as a agent that sort of slaps the leather together. It's not just a piece of the bread on the sandwich. It really feels like it takes control. And I don't know if that's just because it's in its natural state, in an Attar. This is how oud is really meant to be worn. It's meant to be swiped. Or what, but it really feels like the oud note here stands out even more than in EO number 1. And one thing that you'll notice about this fragrance is there's a very old school vibe to it. It's probably the most vintage feeling Ensar fragrance I've ever tried, and he compares it to some of the classical leathers of the past. So he compares it to basically something like this, which is Chanel's Cuir de Russie, one of my favorite leathers of all time, one of the greatest perfumes ever made. And imagine, I don't know if you've ever smelled this bottle, but this bottle in particular. So I also have a Eau de Cologne version of Cuir de Russie from the 70s, I want to say, is that bottle. This is an 80s bottle, 80s or an early 90s bottle. I can't remember exactly which one, but it doesn't matter. This bottle is my favorite version of Cuir de Russie, but the Eau de Cologne is fantastic as well. But it's a little bit, the Eau de Cologne's a little bit different. It has more of that Chanel floral combination that you've come to know from Chanel with the heavy jasmine and ylang ylang and stuff like that. And increased powderiness. This has increased animalics. That's sort of why I bring it up as a comparison to EO1. They smell absolutely nothing alike if you just do a side-by-side, but they feel somewhat similar. And so imagine Ensar Oud taking something like this and adding his signature oud to it, right? That's the feeling of it. This Cuir de Russie, you know, fragrance that has this old school vibe, this very traditional feel. And the lavender even adds to that even more. And so, according to the Ensar website, he says that he's not trying to one-up these master perfumers that made him from the past. His hope is to add to the tradition. And so he says that he delved into all of these vintage fragrances he can, and he said there's one ingredient that would basically make any leather aroma explode, yet no one uses it, and of course that's the oud. So he says he added this oud-inspired rendition to the legacy of something like Old English leather, Cuir de Russie, you know, that kind of thing. And so from the website, I'll just read you a little bit of the blurb. It says it oozes sensuality and is courtesy of the eclectic fusion of oud with pristine Indian rue gulab. This release features a host of new ingredients that steps up the tops to make the opening richer, spicier, and more polished than the first iteration. So apparently, according to that he's saying this is like a second iteration of Sultan Leather Attar. So I don't know. I have no clue which one I'm necessarily smelling, but just something to make note there, because I knew this came out probably about 5 or 6 years ago, if I'm not mistaken. So you know, the fact that it was still on the website tells me they're definitely doing different batches. This edition was actually made to form the heart of what became Ood Royale. I've never smelled Ood Royale. The perfume. This means that Sultan Leather Attar features the same batch of Mitti Kina Oud. If anyone knows what that is, leave it in the description. I've never smelled Mitti Kina, or I don't know how to, you know, pick out Mitti Kina Oud. That went into Ood Royale. In all likelihood, this oud has been in the Sultan's collection since the 1980s and smells replete with the old oud goodness nothing but time can impart into a bottle. And I don't mean we added a few drops to tell a story. About a quarter of Sultan Leather Attar is oud. So I don't know if that's true for all of the batches or just the newer one he's talking about. So he says it features some of the rarest ouds on earth, but because it was made for Ood Royale, it also features the same Indian oud that gave Ood Royale such a beautiful sparkle. So the Ensar Sparkle, that's the easiest way to think about the way this smells. Imagine a salty, sparkly leather fragrance with that oud note. And the oud here is slightly, very slightly animalic, just like the castoreum in leather is slightly animalic, but it's not over the top. It's very well blended, and you know, the smokiness of the, I guess it's Cambodian oud that adds a little bit of the smokiness here. I'm not sure about the different types of oud that are listed, that are used. I can't pick out each oud. That's one thing that I'm not going to sit here and pretend to be an oud expert or anything like that. But he says that there's spiciness from Burmese oud, and I think there's probably a little bit of this smokiness from the Cambodian oud. Maybe a touch of sweetness from the Thai oud. And so I don't know all the different types of oud, but there might even be a little bit of this slightly animalic earthiness from this Chinese oud as well. It's hard to say how many different types of ouds are used in here. But definitely one thing that I will tell you is that it is an extremely balanced composition. And that's one of the reasons I really fell in love with it is my favorite leathers are always super animalic. So when I reviewed EO1, I mentioned things like Antaeus, or, you know, you talk about things like Bellamy, or some of my other favorite leathers, which are more challenging to wear, let's say. This is, I honestly think that this could be a signature scent just because of how well blended it all is. But even with the extreme blending, you get all of these little details. That's why I love this fragrance so much, because the floral bits remind me of vintage floral fragrances from the late 80s. So you think about things, you think about these masculine floral fragrances, like even Fahrenheit. That's a leather. Fahrenheit's actually a great. Fahrenheit is, now that I'm really thinking about it, Fahrenheit is actually a good example of, let's say, a designer. Not that it smells anything like EO number one. These type of fragrances will never smell the same. But imagine the idea of Fahrenheit with that gasoline opening, right? Except for instead of the gasoline opening in EO1, sorry, I keep saying EO1, in Sultan Leather Attar, but basically the same type of fragrance idea, is instead of that gasoline violet leaf opening like in Fahrenheit, in EO1 you get that Ensar sparkle with the ambergris and the leather sort of sandwiched between the rose oud and the castoreum, and the slight animalics and, you know, that rose oud combination. And then you get this floral bit. And, you know, in Fahrenheit, it's things like chamomile. And there's actually a huge floral heart in Fahrenheit. Most people don't realize it, but go look at all the florals in Fahrenheit. And when you wear it, try to pay attention to the florals whenever you wear Fahrenheit. And you'll notice just how huge the florals are. And it dries down to a leather. So actually, Sultan Leather Attar starts as a leather. And whenever it finishes almost like a leather as well, like an oudi leather. And so in the mid, you know, when you're smelling the florals in Sultan Leather Attar, obviously you're going to smell the rose, because the rose really starts to make a bigger appearance about an hour in, which is about where I'm at right now with this dab. You know, I'm getting close to the hour mark. And so, you know, at the hour mark, that's really where the rose starts to emerge even further from the depths of the fragrance. And I think there's Taif rose used here. I'm sure there's multiple types of rose. They said, you know, Himalayan rose, bourbon rose, Turkish rose, Gaiac rose, all these different types of roses. And it does smell like a really high quality rose blend. But every time I wear this, there's this very relaxing tea-like smell in the floral heart as it starts to come forward. And so that's one of the reasons why I think there's this Taif rose as well. It could also be like an Indian rose, but it doesn't feel very jammy. It doesn't feel like the, you know, synthetic rose molecules you're used to smelling. Don't think about a rose like you know, like you would smell from Dolce & Gabbana, The One Mysterious Night. Even though I like that fragrance, the rose there has this synthetic jamminess to it. Here, there's nothing but this naturalness to the rose smell. And the relaxing tea-like accord with the floral heart is just absolutely brilliant. And one other thing, outside of the oud feeling maybe a little bit more pronounced in Sultan Leather Attar, is I keep getting this green touch from it somewhere. And I have no clue where that's coming from, because if it's just rose, leather, and oud, I have no clue where this green touch is coming from. I mean, I guess you could have some ouds that give off a slightly medicinal green feeling, but there's this green touch to Sultan Leather Attar that I don't remember getting as much of in EO number one. So, you know, just imagine as that initial salty Ensar sparkle with the animalic castoreum and the leather, and, you know, all of that is sort of right in your face in the first hour. By hour 1, 2, 3, you almost get this vintage 80s decaying floral, you know, tea-like vibe. Very, almost relaxing in a sense, but extremely high quality. Like I said, $5,000 leather jacket high quality. That's the feeling of it. Walk in and just go straight to the most expensive leather jacket. And the reason that this is different from other leather jacket smell, you know, I talk about, if you watched my Tom Ford video from yesterday where I ranked my favorite Tom Fords, and I only did full bottles, by the way. So some of the ones I have decants of, like Moss Brex and stuff like that, got left out. But I'll do a full review of Moss Brex, and so many people were mentioning it as one of their favorite Tom Fords, and I agree, it's one of mine too. But I only have a decant, so I didn't put it in my countdown. But you know, one of the reasons that this seems so different and so high class compared to some of the other leather scents that go into this leather jacket or leather couch feel or something like that is that some of those fragrances, like Tuscan Leather, for example, give off this, you know, bad boy vibe, right? Imagine this like guy who just is old enough to drink, you know, wearing a leather jacket that's been hanging in his garage for the last 3 years or something, right? That's not the feeling of this leather jacket. This leather jacket is, you know, you just won the lottery and you can go buy yourself the most expensive leather jacket possible. And you're not buying it from TJ Maxx for $89.99. You're buying the $5,000, the $7,000 leather jacket. There's this very high quality feel to the leather, and it has to do with the combination of that ambergris sparkle leather and then of course the oud that's being used as well. And you know, sometimes oud can have this resinous, leathery like feel to it as well. And it just all plays together absolutely brilliantly. And then you get to the base. And the base gives off this, the final note, which just is the coup de grace for me. And it's this smoky tobacco note. So just imagine the high power lawyer that I mentioned earlier, right? He had a long day, right? He's sitting on his rooftop. He takes his tie off and he's sitting on the rooftop of his 100-floor building, looking at the city around him that he basically owns, right? He's the boss of the city. And, you know, he's, imagine like the ending of a Boston Legal, right? If you ever watch Boston Legal, imagine the ending of a Boston Legal show, and they're sitting on the roof and they have their extremely expensive liquor, their scotch, their whiskey, whatever their drink of choice is. And, they're smoking an expensive cigar. They're smoking a Cuban cigar, right? Because of course they are. And they're just enjoying the night, right? But that smoke kind of just gets infused with that leather, the jacket. He takes his tie off, he puts the leather jacket on, right? That's the feel, that tobacco smoke base. And it's not just tobacco, because it's also mixed with frankincense and these other smoky type elements. But the ingredients are out of this world. It's absolutely fantastic. It's my favorite Ensar, hands down. Would I buy a bottle of Sultan Leather Attar? No, because I am a spray fanatic. And so even though I'm enjoying swiping this right before bed, this is going to get washed off in the morning and I'm going to spray another perfume tomorrow. Because that's part of my routine. That's one of my biggest issues with Attars. Is I understand all you need is a drop. I understand that it projects. I understand all of this stuff. But I have this routine where I'm a guy that likes to spray. And so I'm enjoying getting to know these Attars, and I'm going to do some videos on those Henri Jacques, you know, Attar fragrances basically is what they are, that have been sitting there forever too. So you're going to hear more about Attars, and Sultan Pasha sending me some stuff. So you're going to hear more about Attar fragrances. But if you have ever, had a chance to smell Sultan Leather Attar, I would love to know your thoughts. I really do enjoy this. I like this DNA a lot. I think this is Ensar operating at, you know, full speed ahead here. This is Ensar operating at ludicrous speed, okay? And he really nails this one. I really like Jungle Kinam as well. And I really like Tiger Lust. I've come to really enjoy more and more of his fragrances. But this DNA is the one that, as a vintage guy, as a guy where my heart is with vintage, and I'm a leather fanatic, this is the one that really just grabs me. You know, that smoky birch. If you like the smoky birch tar, like Cuir de Russie feel of a leather fragrance, this is the artisanal version of it, if that makes sense. Because it recreates the smoky birch element using Middle Eastern frankincense and smoky Cambodian smelling oud and the spicy Burmese oud and the castoreum and the rose and all, you know, this Middle Eastern style, but it recreates one of my absolute favorite style of perfumes in something like Cuir de Russie. So that's my take on Sultan Leather Attar. If you have experience, do let me know. Thank you very much, Nick, for sending me that generous decant so I can get to know it. You know, I can play with it, I can wear it, and it's been an absolute pleasure, mate. So thank you. I hope you guys appreciate this video. Do leave a comment below. Cheers, and I'll catch you next time. Bye-bye.